Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. I think last I was here 3 years ago, I was invited to speak on Tillich, and even at Princeton Seminary, I could sometimes get tired of the great white European fathers, and I happened to be teaching Gustavo Gutierrez at that point in time, so I was glad that they adjusted and allowed me to come share with you some of my interest in Gustavo Gutierrez, the Peruvian Latin American liberation theologian. We had a good time then, and if you want to do some more on it, I have a book you can look at by Gutierrez, which is the same series that my book on Tillich is in. So if you want more of Tillich and more of Gutierrez, both are available here. I was preparing for this and aware that this subject matter, Paul Tillich and his work, is something I have taught probably longest at Princeton than any other course. I've taught it almost every other year, over 30 years. And so I have a lot to say, and my publications have been fairly constant on it, although I probably wouldn't be identified as the Tillich scholar among a host of those. I don't go often enough to the North American Paul Tillich Society meetings because I'm interested in what Tillich might mean for life and struggle, and of course for faith, and I'll get into that. Given how much I have to say over the last week and when preparing these remarks, I found myself increasingly wondering, how am I going to do this within that time period? I came up with several outlines, and they all were okay, but they weren't quite what I wanted. So I came back with another kind of outline, more of a collage that I use. This is the one I like best from one of my courses on Paul Tillich that I'll say a word on in a minute. A collage of the life of times of Paul Tillich, which I will comment on as a way to introduce some of the three themes that I'm going to get into today. But let me start this way, and not to nurture too much apocalyptic dread in any of us with these remarks, but from sea to shining sea. That's our nation. From the Canadian border to the southern border. Another way to talk about the boundaries of our nation. And then we can think of all the eternal dynamics, the history. Imagine a turning point of perhaps unforeseen crisis proportions, where it all comes apart. We not only are nervous about our borders, which many people are feeling anyway, but our borders are in fact violated. Imagine just one, say, so-called tactical nuclear device makes it inside our borders. And imagine a government that goes into not just elongated shutdown, but collapse, allowing our peoples to square off against one another with all kinds of regional and political conflicts, where nothing is as we have felt it to be all of our lifetimes, where things are in such a way that we did not think we would live to see. Can you have any kind of picture of that at all? If you can, and I hope you can, maybe some of you live with this, I do from time to time. I tell my students this. Imagine you're not preparing for some secure church somewhere, but you're going into times where the very idea of church is in question, and churches have trouble staying intact, not because they're under persecution necessarily, but simply because the times are chaotic. The times and the places are in a state of ruins, okay? I begin this way with that imaginative exercise, not to keep us there all morning, but to say this is the kind of context within which Paul Tillich began his theology. And it's a context that predates the time of the Nazis. We often think of these three theologians, Tillich today, Bonhoeffer next week, Karl Barth last time, simply in relationship to the rise of the Nazis begun in 1933 through their fall in 1945 at the end of World War II. But there's a crucial period between the end of World War I and the rise in 1919 and the rise of the Nazis in 1945 that is crucial for understanding the rise of the Nazis and for understanding another period of great chaos and ruin. It is in the period of 1918-1919 that Paul Tillich began doing his work as Europe, and especially Germany, and his city of Berlin was literally in ruins and in chaos. I have with me, as I say, this collage of Tillich's life, and it begins generally in the upper left-hand corner with some images of World War I. You see the young Tillich in uniform there in the brownish photo in his chaplain's uniform. He was a chaplain who served not just in the Prussian military, but also in the trenches. He was gravedigger and pastor. He was gravedigger and professor, and went off to give lectures even while going back to the limbs torn and lost in the trenches. Almost all the biographers say that this was the turning point in Tillich's life. Whatever he went through with the Nazis later, and he did have to flee the Nazis when they rose, he was the first Christian professor to be put on a list to be purged along with Jewish folk out of Germany. So he left in 1933, invited by Reinhold Niebuhr here at Union Theological Seminary to come to New York City, which he did. But that was only after some 12 to 15 years after the end of World War I, wrestling with the ruined state of his German people's fate after World War I. So you see these general images of a young Tillich from the upper left-hand corner. You move to the upper right corner of the Weimar Republic, a period of, some would say, cultural chaos, but also of extreme creativity. A period of Freud and Einstein and many thinkers like Hannah Arendt, who you see just by the corner of the Theology of Paul Tillich square in the middle. Other figures, the young Tillich there again, Bertolt Brecht, the great poet of the Weimar Republic. Up in the far right-hand corner is Rosa Luxemburg, the creative Marxist of the period. You have the brown shirts over on the left-hand side again. One of the reasons Tillich was dismissed is because he stood up for Jewish students when he was a dean at the University of Frankfurt when they were being attacked by the brown shirts. He also wrote a book at the far right here called The Socialist Decision, which is what really got him on the watch list by the Nazis and eventually put out of the country. His kind of socialism, as we'll see in a minute, was a kind of socialism which challenged the nationalist socialism of the Nazis. The substance of his thinking was not just against authoritarianism, but also against the romance of the nation that the Nazis also featured. I won't go through all of this, but in the middle here, you see Tillich with other family members and friends in Germany. You see the book burning to the right under his book in brown here, The Socialist Decision. You see him with Reinhold Niebuhr in about the middle of the page there against those two windows. And then you see him in various phases of being an American theologian, which he became between 1933 and 1965 when he died, after teaching first at the Union Seminary, as I said, then having gone on to Harvard, and then to the University of Chicago. It's quite a history. Now, this was a period also when nuclear warfare was inaugurated in 1945, and the Cold War kept us all tense with nuclear threats. It was a period of the civil rights movement, about which he said little. Malcolm X, down in the far right corner, died in April of 1965. Tillich himself would die in 1965, and both would be featured in Time magazine, Tillich even with a cover article, and both in Life magazine. So start that way, thinking about that. What kind of theologian do you become with this kind of experience? When he came to the United States, he had to introduce himself, he felt, to the audience here. And remember, he came knowing almost no English. So he had to learn it at age 47. which means he was a fairly formed scholar at this period and had many publications. But as his English got better, he published a book entitled On the Boundary. And he says this about the importance of boundary experiences in understanding his life and thought. Hear this one paragraph. In the introduction to my 1923 book, Religious Presence, or it could be translated Religious Realization, I wrote, says Tillich, quote, "The boundary is the blessed place for acquiring knowledge," end quote. When I was asked to give an account of the way my ideas have developed from my life, I thought that the concept of the boundary might be the fitting symbol for the whole of my personal and intellectual development. At almost every point, I have had to stand between alternative possibilities of existence, to be completely at home in neither, and to take no definitive stand against either. Since thinking presupposes receptiveness to new possibilities, you hear that? Since thinking presupposes receptiveness to new possibilities, real thinking, you believe, this position on the boundary is fruitful for thought, but it is a difficult and dangerous place in life, which again and again demands decisions and thus the exclusion of alternatives. This disposition and its tension have determined both my destiny and my work. If that makes you want to read Tillich a lot more, I hope it does. It helps account for some of the things I'm going to summarize about his thought, which is difficult, but I want you to go back to the question that I posed at the beginning. How would you think amidst the ruins of all the life you have known? Tillich had to occupy that kind of boundary situation between life as he knew it and life as he was living it now with his contemporaries in ways he didn't think he would ever have to do. He was starting from scratch, and he was thinking on the boundary of life and death. He had seen it up close in the trenches, he was feeling it with his people, and he was thinking anew. No category of his Lutheran Protestant background prepared him for this, he felt. In fact, somehow he felt the way Christianity was constituted was in fact part of the problem that Europe had descended into World War I and that his capital city of Berlin was in ruins. So start there. If Tillich is difficult for Protestants, and in some ways I think he's the one more difficult of the three that you're considering, I'm not sure the other presenters would agree with this, but I'll say this, because, why? Because Tillich risked a non-traditional language. He felt that the traditional language somehow was not adequate. He couldn't just say Jesus Christ. He had to say Jesus the Christ. That kind of bothered people. Why would he do that? Because Christ isn't last name. It isn't Jesus' last name. It's a title ascribed to him under very complex conditions. Tillich wanted to know, well, how did the Christ, Messiah, Christos title get attached to Jesus anyway? Everything was in a state of interruption for him, you see, and he had to ask basic questions. Similarly, he couldn't just talk about sin and confessing sin. What's sin? He kept the word, but most of the time in his writings on sin, he would talk about alienation, estrangement, and explore those in their depth and with cultural resources from a Marx or a Nietzsche and a Freud or a Heidegger or many other thinkers of his day. He couldn't just get the God talk going, okay? He pursued something called a theology of culture. And even when he wrote a systematic theology about the traditional doctrines, they didn't look very traditional to people. And it worried them and bothered them, okay? So if it's difficult for you and me, those are some of the reasons why. So let me talk about my first theme here after these matters introductory, a theology of culture, as I have it on the chart here. The phrase is one coined by Tillich himself, and I want to get right into it. This is maybe the meaty, hardest part of my remarks today. but try to track with me if you can. Remember, this man is working from scratch amidst the ruins as a philosopher and theologian. What does he come up with? The phrase theology of culture first emerged in 1919 as Germany was in the throes of post-World War I chaos. Remembered, Russia had just had its communist revolution in October of 1918. So socialism and communism were live options in Berlin. Should this be the way we should go, given the collapse of everything else? The old feudal and capitalist guards in Germany were in fact quite nervous. In January of 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, two of the most creative and strategic planners and spokespeople of Marxist socialism, were assassinated. Amidst a time of his own broken marriage and many displaced friends, he wrote in 1919 this to describe the scene. The political problems determined our whole existence. Even after revolution and inflation, there were matters of life and death. The social structure was in a state of dissolution. Human relations with respect to authority, education, family, sex, friendship, and pleasure were in a creative chaos. Many have pointed out that the Paul Tillich, who went off to be the Prussian chaplain in the trenches, came back the very opposite of what he was before. Before, he was kind of an uptight Lutheran kid. But when he came back, he was a bohemian playboy in Berlin for most of his times, as well as wrestling with all of these issues and problems. It was in this context of 1919 that many, in fact, came to look to Tillich, because remember, he was already at age 28, and certainly by age 32, a formed philosopher and theologian with teaching credentials, and was operative. For him to be turning freshly to the situation of ruin was meaningful to many people, looking for internal meaning as well as external imagination about what the culture and society should look like. And he set forth his view of the situation in a lecture entitled The Thoughts on the Theology of Culture. Now, some ways to introduce this phrase. First, what is meant by culture? Culture is not focused for him just on the fine arts, as highbrow circles might talk about the fine arts of culture, music, and being cultured, as we sometimes say. No, for Tillich, culture meant more all the forms that structure life. Again, internally and externally, personally and politically. Culture could be the fine arts, yes, but also there were the rituals of political process, elections, the patterns of education, the way authority was structured, family tradition structured, business and corporations, market economies, kinship and sexual practices. All of these are culture. They have different realms, of course. Kinship, say, family, say, business. But they were all culture for him, okay? So if theology focuses on something called culture, it's looking at this manifold of forms. So what does theology mean in Tillich's notion of a theology of culture? Well, as I've already suggested to you, it's not traditional God talk. It did not invoke Jesus quickly, or spirit, or church language, or the creedal formulas. No, instead, his theology was interested in this crisis moment in an analysis of what he called religion in the cultural scene. Religion was understood as a dimension of culture, that part or deep place in culture where there resides an ultimate concern, where people would say what really matters to them is this. That's the religious for Paul Tillich. And most usually for Tillich, in that place, you will find people leaning into the beyond. But the beyond never as a place outside of culture. It's a beyond that's in the deep places of culture. This is what's somewhat hard to get a hold of. This means if you look at culture for Paul Tillich, it's not that you have realms of culture like art, music, politics, business, and all the rest, and then maybe you have religion. No, that's not the way he would do it. He would go ahead and list the many realms of culture and then say in all of them, in their deep places, is where you find the religious, where you find the issues of ultimate concern being grappled with. So one might do, as a theologian of culture, a theological analysis of the religious dimension of politics. There's a whole book of essays by Tillich, grouped together now, called Art and Architecture, a Theological Reading. And what that means is not that it's linked to Jesus, God, and church and all the rest, but that he's looked at the architecture, whether it's church or not, which signals certain things about people's ultimate concerns and how they lean into some sense of the beyond. Now, this beyond that is the concern of the theologian looking at culture and its deep places, this beyond is sometimes referred to Tillich as the unconditioned, that which has no conditions. Now, that's kind of a difficult philosophical term to get a hold of. It was current in much of the philosophy of Tillich's time. And I'd like to suggest that one way to get at it, let me give you two examples. One is from Tillich's writing itself in the 1950s, later in the United States. He talked about the formation of the phenomenon of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And you could say, well, how did that come to be? And you might explain, well, there were the conditions of Shakespeare's time. There's the conditions of Shakespeare's giftedness. There are the conditions of earlier writers that shaped Shakespeare. There were historical vicissitudes in Shakespeare's time. There was the talent of Shakespeare with phrasing and all of the rest. But still, there's Hamlet. And Hamlet cannot be reduced to all of those conditions. There's something more than the sum of the parts here. Something more than all the conditions we can name. There's an unconditioned element of Hamlet simply in Hamlet's being, the being of Hamlet. And of course, I'm mindful of the famous phrase, well, to be or not to be the question. But the point of Tillich's here is that the sheer being of Hamlet has something about it that is unconditioned, even though all of those conditions were necessary to its emergence. Or I've talked with people off and on about relationships, and I'm kind of cognizant of this too. Think about a good relationship, or a relationship that has a quality you value. You can tell the story of how it came about, what you went through together, who you were and what you brought to the relationship, and what the other person was and what they brought. But there remains something about the relationship that has this quality of being unconditioned, in the sense that you cannot explain it simply by referencing all of those conditions. No matter how long you might tell all the stories, there's something other about it. And of course, this is not an otherworldly unconditioned. It's an unconditioned that's right at the heart of your conditioned being. Right there is the sense of Tillich's understanding of the unconditioned, of the transcendent. It's not other, above, way out there, beyond, certainly not in the by and by, like pie in the sky that we sometimes critique. It's certainly not that. But it's as the unconditioned amidst the conditions of life that Tillich was a theologian of culture, going after the unconditioned in the many realms of culture. Okay? So, Tillich believed as a theologian of culture that what you best do is to continually analyze these surprising emergences of the unconditioned in cultural life. And in continuing to do that, you refine culture in the way it needs to be done, and you also refine your understanding of what the religious is, always in relationship to culture. You never have them apart from one another. Okay. So now let us come to Tillich's interest in religious socialism. I come to this not just because it's one piece of Tillich's thinking. Quite to the contrary, it was a central piece of especially the pre-1933 Tillich, when things were in chaos. But even when he came to the United States, he started writing about many other things. In the final years of his life, in an interview in Christian Century magazine, he was asked, have you moved beyond religious socialism? And he said, no, there's nothing beyond religious socialism. That's how seriously he took it, and I've kind of gone back and reread his later works where people think that as socialism falls away and he becomes kind of just supposedly a personal existentialist. But that's not so. If you read it carefully, you can still see what I'm going to talk about as his religious socialism. So I turn to it because it's also a theme that extends throughout all of his life. But do recall that the young Tillich was influenced by this state of Germany in ruins. And in that kind of state, you have to rethink the very nature of the body politic and how it's going to work. And socialism was not just an option, it was a live option, with people by the thousands marching in the street regularly all the way through 1919 and 1804. It was so threatening that the feudal and capitalist powers felt like they had to assassinate its best leaders. Okay? So he had to wrestle with it. And what would it mean for a theologian concerned with the unconditioned to affirm and relate to socialism? What he's doing here then is he's looking for the deep places of the political life in Germany and trying to come up with a way to articulate theology in relationship to those deep places. Later he would even say we need theological faculties for the new unifying culture emerging and springing from socialist soil of our times. Now, of course, we need to ask, what does Tillich mean by socialism? He clarified that in his book, The Socialist Decision, which he published in 1933, which he also said was his favorite book among the many he published. And it was the one that was confiscated and burned that you can see in the right-hand middle portion of a book burning in Frankfurt, where he taught last. It's important to grasp that Tillich had two elements that he saw crucial to socialism. One is what he called a particular element, and the other was a universal element. The particular element maybe we're more familiar with. This is the element where you give primacy to the lives of those crying out on the underside of the system who are marginalized or repressed and exploited. And you mobilize your new society in such a way that you hear those lives. Again, you have to remember in Berlin, you're seeing lines and lines of people all over the metropolis, standing in line for bread, for food, for work. Unemployment reached unimaginable proportions. So a socialist hears the particular voices of such as these in society, which of course at this time were not a minority, they were a majority. It's a group of suffering, exploited peoples who lift their voices, yes, but who also organize, and they cultivate the dreams of their poor and their poverty in such a way that they dream the possibility of sharing in the goods of life. Becoming committed to the needs of these poor and the poor's own agency, not just paternally giving them things, but becoming committed to the way they organize and the way they resist and the way they struggle. This is the particular conviction of socialism that makes socialism what it is. It takes that part of the social world and lifts it up, and in a very particular way. And here we come to in some ways, the uniqueness, although it's not only Tillich who says this, but he said it in a unique way and with a religious meaning that we'll get to in a minute. What is the universal element of socialism for Tillich? The universal element lies in the fact that when poor and exploited parts of the society, that particular element, find the ability to move beyond themselves and link their own particular struggle to the struggle of the whole society, including even the capitalist bourgeoisie, including even the romantic nationalists. It doesn't mean that you leave behind one iota of the suffering and exploitation and the consciousness of being oppressed that the particularly poor may have. But you know how to articulate, this is the universal element, how that expression of particular pain by the poor can be something owned by the whole and become the means of transforming the whole of society for all peoples in that society. It is this enabling of the all that is crucial. Sometimes when people ask me about my own brand of socialism, and I'll not distract you all with going into that today, but this part of my own view is consonant with the way I understand Tillich to be articulating it. We all have all kinds of thoughts that come up when we hear the word socialism, right? And we may all blanch, some of us may say yes, some of us may have all kinds of feelings in between. I often point out, though, that if we take one of the standard, almost cliches, but it's a very valuable phrase, I would say, of our democratic convictions, thank you very much. If we take one of the very standard phrases, the phrase that all, as it said in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Let's just say all are created equal. Since then, we've revised it to include women. We say we've revised it to include the emancipated slave, and so on. What socialism does is it takes with ever new seriousness the all in the affirmation that all are created equal. Socialism is the ever vigilant desire and will to redress the social situation so that truly all are considered equal and have opportunities for equality. At its basic, I think that's what socialism is. It refuses to never assume that we're agreed upon and have attained a system that is one that really works for all. It continues to turn to the particular voices still exploited and says, are they really included in the all or not? This is to cultivate a kind of socialism that is universally inclined as well as particularly focused. What is interesting about Tillich's religious socialism is the way he considers a certain attitude of both Christian and Jewish, and sometimes he says also Muslim traditions, to cultivate what he calls a prophetic attitude. This is an attitude based in the great Hebrew prophets, an attitude that takes the doing of justice not just as a moral action or a moral principle, but as a way of knowing God and a kind of positioning of society in such a way that all people's needs are met. This is something that he saw Jesus, when he wrote about Jesus, cultivating to an intense degree. A basic affirmation of the needs of every person to be free of that which does not liberate them. And so the famous Lucan passage in chapter 3 about Jesus saying, I bring liberty to the captives, is taken very seriously here as not just something for the captives, but for all peoples who are captive, often in a very material way. So there's this prophetic dimension that grounds his religious socialism. Now, this kind of religious socialism, as much prophetic action, can founder on two threats. And Tillich was very, very aware of this. You can talk about the particulars so much, the exploited poor, that you lose a sense of the connection to the larger emancipation of the whole society. But just as equally problematic, and Tillich worried about this a great deal because he saw the comfortable bourgeois folk of his time reacting this way, and in some ways we are still prone to it today. You want to talk about the universal so much that you forget about the very difficult actions that have to be taken to really redress what the marginalized and exploited are going through. You fail to engage in the fundamental, often revolutionary changes that need to be made if the needs of the poor are to be heard, and if your own and all society's needs are to have a chance of being redressed. Holding this together, again, the call of the poor and its primacy and the needs of the whole is not easy. I have time for an example, I think. And maybe I'll take this from a phrase that has even been worked into Pope Benedict's decree about liberation theology, where he finally said, after years of being pressured by liberation theologians, that there can be something called, and let me unpack this phrase a little bit, the non-exclusive privileged option of the poor. Sounds like a contradiction in terms. The non-exclusive privileged option of the poor. Privileged option sounds like you're lifting up the poor above everyone else, that only their needs matter to God. But actually the claim is that precisely that is the way not only to lift up the needs of the poor, but to restore the matrix of the whole. To exemplify this further, in another example, I sometimes give that of, imagine a mother or father settling a fight between an older, stronger brother and a younger brother. You, of course, in a healthy family, you love the whole family, and so you love both of these brothers, even when they're having a fight. But when one older brother really has the younger brother in a life-threatening or injury-threatening situation, the parent, as a good parent, will intervene on the side of the younger one that's getting beaten badly and pull, whatever is appropriate, the older one aside. There's a scandalously particular intervention, but it's not done just to take the side of that one. It is in that moment, but it is done ultimately for the benefit of the whole, for the whole family, for both boys in this case, thinking of two sons. Something like that captures the strange tension between advocacy for the scandalously politically poor, whether we think of those of other nations in relation to powerful nations, or if we think of groups within our social life. This captures the tension at the heart of Tillich's religious socialism. And he believed it was the prophetic attitude in Christianity and some of the other Abrahamic faiths. He didn't write about other faith traditions other than the Abrahamic faiths very much, although later in his life he started exploring some of these great Eastern religions. So now, in these last minutes, let me come to the question of confronting romantic nationalism. His religious socialism in the 1930s was unpopular on two fronts, as you can imagine. One front is that on which he encountered the capitalists of his day. Those who had been involved in investing in weapons industry before World War I and during World War I, competing with France, with England, and later with the United States, who had developed a whole kind of warrior culture that was tied in with business in Germany. They did not want to relinquish their place in society as part of the capitalist elite. So they would not tolerate socialism, a kind of commitment to distribution for the poor. Their situation, though, after World War I was strongly threatened by all the chaos unleashed after the war, by the insurgence of socialism with a great new strength. So what did they have a tendency to do, the capitalists? They had a tendency to make common cause with the romantic nationalists of that day. And the romantic nationalists par excellence of this day were the Nazis. In fact, the Nazis were called themselves the National Socialists. Tillich had to challenge the National Socialists, those who promised that society would be better if you just celebrated the nation, romanced the nation, we could say. This is why Tillich called Nazism a political romanticism, because it was romanticizing the nation. It was romanticizing blood, soil, the tradition of the German people, the German Volk. And he saw this as fundamentally problematic, and here he has much in common with Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer and what's often called the confessing church in Germany that said no to that way of thinking. That leads to obedience to the Führer, as the sole leader championing Roman culture. And you know the Aryanism of the German period and the Nazis, the celebration of whiteness, and the destruction unleashed was not only against the Jews by the millions, but also against millions of Slavs and the disabled and the sexually non-conforming, against the Roma peoples and a host of others that were weak and infirm. When you go down the road, Tillich said, of a nationalized socialism, you risk running out of control, so drunk with your romance of the nation that you cannot make commitments to other nations and see the needs of other people that don't romance the nation within. So he took a firm stance against the Nazis in this way. But in challenging this romantic nationalism, and here's the interesting thing about Tillich's take on socialism in a way, I want to leave you with this. He had sharp words for his socialist friends who also challenged it with him. Because why? Because he said his socialist friends were so busy talking about a just arrangement of society that they had no resources to say what's good about the nation in the whole panoply of many other nations. It's like everything was focused on just form. And consequently, the socialists could not appeal to the needs people have of belonging, usually to a shared society, to a shared group of people, and belonging to a land, and belonging to a lineage. Tillich always believed that even though that's dangerous, it's a powerful need of humanity to have a mythology that in a way values and celebrates where it came from, its people, its land, and the beauties of the land. And so he said to his fellow socialists, and he says this repeatedly throughout his book, The Socialist Decision, if you cannot devise a religious socialism or any other kind of, say, a secular socialism that speaks to people's need to belong to a shared space and place, you will lose those people to the extreme romantic nationalists that really have nothing on their agenda other than celebrating the nation without justice to the peoples. So the question that Tillich continually raised, how can we celebrate the nation? And if you start to think a little bit about our own context here in the United States, that's appropriate. How can you celebrate the nation in a way that avoids the kind of romanticization of the nation that we often call American exceptionalism, lifting it above all nations at the expense of other nations? How can you do that? How can you celebrate the good of belonging to a nation without falling into, and I have no trouble saying this myself, it's where I am, we could talk about this another time, without falling into a Trumpian make America great again chauvinism that leaves the needs of other people unattended to and only gives talking points to making the needs of all peoples within the United States important. It's a dangerous thing. And it must be said that Tillich and his religious socialists did not succeed in finding a way to celebrate the nation of Germany. And consequently, there was a void. And it was filled by the romantic nationalism of the Nazis. And the culture went the way of that fascism instead of finding a way to do it that would avoid that. How did Tillich suggest avoiding it? And I can stop with this, and it will not solve all matters, but it will leave us talking perhaps a little bit. Tillich maintained that you have to find a language for loving your land, loving your people, loving your groups. It's very particular in that regard, but that also articulates the beauty and the land and the language of other groups, sharing one earth. And by the way, for Tillich, the material and the natural was a very powerful conduit of the religious and the unconditioned for him. When you find a way of loving the valleys, the majestic mountains, the parks, the waterways of your own place and people, in a way that flows into a love of other people's places and majestic mountains and great places and ways of being, then you found, Tillich would say, that kind of basis for a religious socialism that is able not only to challenge exploitative capitalism, but to challenge that kind of religious nationalism that is fostered when people are desperate and despair and just reach for whatever ideology is at hand. As I say, Tillich and his religious socialists, as he admitted, failed at that, or history was too big to turn around in his time, or maybe the Allies kept conditions so vicious for the people of Germany between the wars that there was no chance of recovery without something like Nazism rising in another world war. Whatever the case, Tillich was conscious of the failure. And the question still remains to all of us who might be inclined to do a theology of culture and who might, I would hope, be inclined towards a creative and colorful religious socialism. How do we confront the romantic nationalisms of our day in ways that make for real and lasting justice for all peoples? Okay, I'll stop there and take some questions.